The story you are about to hear does not begin with glory, wealth, or comfort. It begins in the shadows of sacrifice, where love was given freely but repaid with silence, where loyalty was met with abandonment, and where dignity was tested by humiliation. Yet hidden within this journey lies a secret so staggering that it rewrote every perception of who truly held power in the family. What seemed like a tale of loss and poverty would one day erupt into a revelation that left an entire community stunned. Before I unfold how everything changed, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where you're watching from, because your perspective will make this story even more meaningful. Evelyn Carter was born in 1953 in Jackson, Mississippi, in a world that had already decided her place long before she could make choices of her own. Poverty weighed on her family like a constant shadow, and the deep lines of segregation carved into the South meant that being black and poor left her at the bottom of every ladder she tried to climb. Her father worked at a lumber yard, his lungs filled with sawdust until each breath rattled like a warning. But he never complained because each paycheck, no matter how small, kept food on the table. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthier families, bending her back and wearing down her knees on hands and feet that rarely rested. From them, Evelyn learned early that sacrifice was the true definition of love, and that survival demanded strength even when strength felt impossible. As a child, she often carried her books in a paper bag because backpacks were luxuries, and she walked to school in hand-me-down clothes from local charities. Teachers noticed her hunger for knowledge, but also her poverty, and she quickly realized that those with money and lighter skin received kinder treatment. Instead of breaking her spirit, those experiences steeled her determination to succeed in her own way. At 13, she began working odd jobs, washing clothes, babysitting, sweeping porches, and cleaning dishes at the diner to support her family. She gave most of her earnings to her mother, keeping only pennies for herself. And while her peers spent afternoons playing, Evelyn's life revolved around survival. That sense of responsibility etched itself into her bones. At 17, when most girls her age still dreamed about dances and promises, Evelyn found herself pregnant. The boy who whispered vows of forever disappeared the moment he learned of her condition, leaving Evelyn to carry both the child and the shame alone. She gave birth to a son, Malcolm, and when she looked into his eyes, she promised that she would never abandon him the way his father had. 2 years later, history repeated itself when she had a daughter, Serena. Once again, the man who had sworn loyalty fled as soon as responsibility knocked on his door. By 19, Evelyn was the sole guardian of 2 children, with no partner, no wealth, and no safety net. Yet she did not collapse. Instead, she rose with a ferocity she had inherited from her parents' grit. She took a job cleaning offices at night, walking 4 miles each way because bus fare meant less food for her children. The pay was small, the hours long, and the fatigue brutal, but she carried the faces of Malcolm and Serena with her, reminding herself why each step mattered. By day, she babysat other children, and her own little ones sat quietly in the corner, knowing instinctively that Mama could not afford for them to run wild. This cycle of endless work became Evelyn's life, and though exhaustion lived in her bones, she refused to let her spirit be crushed. Each morning at 4, she rose to make oatmeal or toast, press their donated clothes until they looked neat, and kiss their foreheads before sending them off to school. She wanted them to walk with pride, even if their pockets were empty. Her creativity softened the sting of poverty. When 6-year-old Serena looked down at her sneakers, patched with tape, and asked why she couldn't have shoes like the other kids, Evelyn knelt down, pulled out a marker, and drew flowers across the fabric. "Now you've got the prettiest shoes in school," she said, transforming shame into pride with love and imagination. Malcolm, fiery and sensitive, grew angrier as he aged. At 8, he burst through the door one afternoon, tossing his backpack against the wall, tears of frustration streaming down his face. "I hate being poor, Mama. I hate that we don't have what the other kids have." Evelyn set aside the shirt she was mending, pulled him in her arms, and whispered words her own mother once told her. "Rich people got money, but we got each other. And when you've got family who loves you, you've got more wealth than any bank account." He was too young to grasp her meaning, but Evelyn knew seeds were planted in his heart. Nights were the cruelest time. She worked until her body ached, then came home to help with homework, braid Serena's hair, and sing gospel hymns that turned their tiny apartment into a place of hope. Sometimes she collapsed face first into their books, falling asleep mid-sentence. Winters were merciless. The heater in their apartment coughed and groaned, only working occasionally. Evelyn piled every blanket onto her children's bed and curled up on the couch in her thin coat. When Serena found her trembling one morning, she smiled through chattering teeth and said, "I'm not shivering, baby. I'm dancing to music only I can hear." She wiggled her shoulders, making Serena laugh, turning frost into laughter. She often went to bed hungry, lying that she had already eaten. When her stomach growled too loudly, she turned up the little radio to cover the sound. Yet even with an empty belly, she found strength to sway in the kitchen, singing the gospel songs that stitched joy into their days. Every dollar she saved went into a coffee can hidden behind a flour jar. She whispered education money each time she dropped in a crumpled bill. The can was her quiet rebellion against poverty, her investment in a future she would never stop believing in. Her entire identity became sacrifice. Her entire wealth was love, and though her children were too young to understand, every act etched itself into their memories. After sending them to school, she cleaned houses, scrubbed bathrooms, and ironed strangers' clothes until her hands burned, then returned home to babysit neighbors' children to earn a few more dollars before heading off to her night shift cleaning offices. The walk across town to the office building was long and cold in winter, humid and stifling in summer, but Evelyn endured because she saw each step as an investment. Every dollar went towards survival. Every penny tucked into the coffee can meant possibility. That can, hidden behind a bag of flour in the cupboard, became her secret symbol of hope. She called it the education fund, and each time she added a crumpled bill or a handful of coins, she whispered to herself that her children would one day cross the bridge her sacrifice built. Her sacrifices stretched far beyond money. Evelyn became an artist of turning nothing into something. When Serena cried over her taped-up shoes, Evelyn did not shame her for wanting what other children had. Instead, she pulled out a marker and drew little flowers across the fabric, transforming embarrassment into pride. Serena marched into school the next day, telling her classmates that no one else had shoes like hers. Malcolm, older and already noticing the differences between their lives and those of his peers, struggled more. His classmates teased him for bringing peanut butter sandwiches every day, and one afternoon he burst into the apartment shouting that he hated being poor, that he was tired of never having nice things. Evelyn stopped sewing the shirt she had been mending, took him in her arms, and told him words her own mother had once told her. Rich people might have money, but they had something greater. They had each other. At 8 years old, he could not fully grasp the wisdom in those words, but Evelyn hoped they would take root inside him, ready to bloom when he was older. Poverty had ways of attacking dignity in the smallest moments, and Evelyn fought back with creativity and humor. On freezing winter nights, when their heater refused to work, she piled every blanket she had on her children's bed and curled up alone on the couch with nothing but her thin coat for warmth. When Serena woke up and saw her mother shivering, Evelyn smiled and told her she wasn't cold at all, that she was dancing to music only she could hear, shimmying her shoulders until the little girl laughed and forgot about the frost on the windows. Hunger was another enemy Evelyn faced alone. She claimed to have eaten while cooking so her children could have second helpings, though her stomach growled so loudly she sometimes had to turn up the radio to cover the sound. Her weight dropped noticeably during those years, but she never let it stop her from singing gospel hymns in the kitchen, twirling around the stove as if joy itself were a shield against despair. To Malcolm and Serena, she was not just their mother. She was the magician who transformed hardship into laughter, who could take the bitterness of life and sweeten it with love. Yet behind her smiles lay exhaustion so deep it ached in her bones. Nights often ended with her face pressed against homework books, having fallen asleep mid-problem while trying to help Malcolm with math or Serena with spelling. Sometimes she awoke with pen marks across her cheek, her neck stiff from sleeping upright, but she would rise again before dawn to begin the routine anew. The neighborhood women whispered that Evelyn was working herself into an early grave, that no one could keep such a pace forever. But Evelyn believed otherwise. She believed that every shift she took, every floor she scrubbed, every callus on her hands was another plank in the bridge she was building for her children. She reminded herself constantly that her pain was temporary, but their future could be permanent. The truth was, she clung to the vision of their success as if it were oxygen itself, and without that vision, she might have collapsed. Malcolm's fiery spirit continued to flare as he grew older. He wanted more than what their circumstances allowed, and Evelyn feared that his anger at poverty would harden into resentment. She tried to balance discipline with comfort, never letting him forget the value of humility, but also reminding him of his worth. Serena, by contrast, absorbed everything quietly. She noticed her mother's sacrifices in ways her brother did not, often watching her with wide, solemn eyes. One evening, while Evelyn massaged her sore feet after a long day, Serena whispered that when she grew up, she would buy her mama a big house where she would never have to work again. Evelyn smiled, stroked her daughter's hair, and told her not to forget where she came from, because success had a way of making people forget. Serena insisted she could never forget, but Evelyn knew the world had a way of reshaping promises. Still, hearing those words gave her strength. These sacrifices, both large and small, became the architecture of Evelyn's life. They were the silent bricks in the foundation she was building for Malcolm and Serena, the proof that even in poverty, a mother's love could create wealth of another kind. Malcolm's fiery passion for sports earned him recognition at school, and Serena's quiet determination and sharp mind placed her at the top of her class. Evelyn watched them both with pride, convinced that the countless nights she had gone hungry, the winters she had shivered on the couch, and the long walks to and from work had not been in vain. The coffee can she had filled with crumpled bills and coins had already proven useful for school supplies, sports fees, and occasional extras that gave her children dignity among their peers. Each time she pulled from that fund, she whispered to herself that every dollar spent was not lost but invested in their future. When Malcolm received news that he had earned a basketball scholarship to a state college, Evelyn cried tears of joy, hugging him tightly, telling him that he was going to make history for their family. A few years later, Serena, through relentless study and library hours spent in the shelter of air conditioning and heat she could not get at home, won a full academic scholarship to a university several states away. Evelyn could hardly believe that both of her children were being recognized and rewarded for their talents, and she attended their graduations in the same well-worn church dress she had cherished for years. Standing in the crowd, clutching her small purse and wiping tears from her face, she felt like the richest woman alive. Yet, as much as these milestones filled her with pride, they also began to plant the seeds of distance that would grow between them. College was a new world, a world Evelyn herself had never entered. And once her children crossed that threshold, they began slowly to drift away from the home and the mother who had sacrificed everything for them. The apartment that had once been filled with the noise of arguments, laughter, homework questions, and gospel singing suddenly felt cavernous. Evelyn would sit alone in the evenings, remembering Serena's wide eyes watching her men close and Malcolm's fiery complaints about being poor, only to realize that now those same children were far away, speaking of things she could not fully understand. At first, Malcolm called every week, his voice full of excitement as he described practices, classes, and the thrill of independence. Evelyn clung to those calls, her heart soaring with each word, but as semesters passed, the calls grew shorter and less frequent. His voice changed too, no longer the voice of a boy shaped by hunger and sacrifice, but the polished tones of someone learning to belong in a world Evelyn had never known. He stopped coming home during breaks, telling her there were opportunities, internships, or games that required his presence. Serena began with long letters, describing professors who inspired her, books she devoured, and new friends she made. Evelyn read those letters over and over again, storing them in a shoebox under her bed, smiling each time she held them, feeling connected to her daughter despite the miles. But the letters turned into shorter notes, then phone calls squeezed between busy schedules, then text messages Evelyn struggled to read on her old phone. By the time Serena's second year came, Evelyn sometimes waited weeks without hearing her voice. At Malcolm's college graduation, Evelyn spent her last savings on a bus ticket, determined to see her son walk across the stage. She bought herself a new dress, the first new clothing she had purchased in years, and sat in the stadium's crowded seats, her heart bursting with pride when she heard his name called. After the ceremony, she found him among a group of well-dressed friends and their families. She called out, "Malcolm!" Her face lit up with joy. For an instant, his face softened, the expression of the boy she had raised. But when he looked at his companions, something cold replaced it. He walked over, stiff and cautious, telling her she looked tired and suggesting she should rest. When she tried to hug him, he pulled back, and though she smiled and congratulated him, her heart cracked quietly inside. As she turned to leave, she overheard one of his friends ask, "Who was that old woman?" And though she did not wait to hear his answer, the silence she carried home on the bus felt heavier than her small suitcase. When Serena graduated 2 years later, Evelyn did not make the trip. She told herself it was because she could not afford it, but deep down she knew it was because she could not bear the sting of rejection again. She received pictures in the mail of her daughter in cap and gown, standing beside friends and professors, her smile radiant, her eyes focused on a future far from home. Evelyn displayed the pictures proudly in her apartment, but each time she looked at them, she felt a hollow ache. Back home, she continued to work, though her body was beginning to break down. Her knees stiffened, her back screamed each time she bent to scrub a floor, and her hands, battered from years of chemicals and repetitive motions, curled with arthritis. She downsized to a smaller apartment, partly to save money, but mostly because the silence in her old home was unbearable. She still cooked for herself, still sang softly in the kitchen, but the laughter that once joined her songs had long disappeared. Holidays became the loneliest reminders of what she had lost. Malcolm sent cards, sometimes with a gift certificate tucked inside, but they felt formal, impersonal, like the gestures of a distant relative rather than a son. Serena called on Christmas mornings, her voice cheerful but hurried, speaking of her children's activities and family plans while Evelyn listened quietly, offering warm words but feeling like an outsider in her own daughter's life. The neighbors noticed her solitude, and sometimes they stopped by, but most of the time she spent her days alone, watching other families in the neighborhood build lives with children who still ran into their mother's arms. Evelyn sat on her small porch, watching, remembering, and whispering prayers that those mothers never knew the pain of being forgotten. Slowly, she realized that she had been edited out of her children's new lives, not with malice, but with neglect, the kind that stings more because it comes not from hatred, but from indifference. She had survived loneliness after they left for college, but she still held onto the thought that special occasions, graduations, weddings, the great milestones of life, would surely draw them close again. She reminded herself that she had been at every critical moment of their lives, holding them through sickness, celebrating their smallest victories, and protecting them when the world seemed determined to crush them. Surely, she told herself, when the grandest events arrived, they would remember her place in their story. That fragile hope was first put to the test when Malcolm, now a polished graduate climbing through the world of business and basketball connections, announced that he was engaged to a woman from a wealthy and well-connected family. Evelyn received the wedding invitation in the mail, and though it was written in elegant script on heavy cardstock, the formality of it pierced her heart. Her name appeared not as mother of the groom, but simply among the long list of invited guests, as if she were a distant cousin or an acquaintance. She pressed the invitation to her chest, closed her eyes, and told herself that at least she had been included, but deep inside she knew that her role had been erased. Still, she refused to let that truth crush her. She saved every dollar from her night shifts at the hospital and her cleaning jobs, giving up necessities so she could buy herself a new dress and pay for the long bus ride to Atlanta, where the wedding would be held. On the morning of the ceremony, she sat in front of a cracked mirror at a small salon, having her hair styled for the first time in years, telling herself that she would look presentable, that her son would look out into the crowd, see her, and remember who had built his foundation. When she arrived at the church, she was ushered to a seat near the back, her small frame lost in a sea of well-dressed strangers who carried themselves with the effortless confidence of wealth. She sat quietly, hands folded, tears brimming as she watched her son at the altar in a tuxedo that seemed to belong to another world. He looked handsome, strong, every inch the man she had hoped he would become. Yet as she waited for him to glance her way, to smile and nod in recognition, he never did. The ceremony passed, vows exchanged, rings slipped on, and the moment she had once dreamed of, a dance between mother and son, a whispered thank you, an acknowledgement of years sacrificed, never came. At the reception, Evelyn approached the head table. She leaned down, her hands trembling, and whispered, "Congratulations, baby, I'm so proud of you." Malcolm stood stiffly, gave her a quick pat on the back, and muttered thanks before turning back to his new wife. The new bride's mother, adorned in jewelry and style perfection, looked Evelyn up and down with the sharp judgment of someone who had already decided her worth. "Jamar, darling," she asked with dripping sweetness, "who is this?" Evelyn stood waiting, her heart suspended in a moment that stretched like an eternity. Malcolm hesitated before finally saying, "This is Evelyn, my mother." The words fell flat, devoid of warmth or pride, as if introducing a stranger. Evelyn smiled weakly, retreating to the back of the room where she sat alone while the young and wealthy filled the dance floor with laughter. She left before the cake was cut, boarding another long bus home with her new dress wrinkled and her spirit heavy, tears tracing lines down her cheeks. Serena's rejection came more slowly, but it cut just as deep. After finishing her degree, she built a career in social work and married a man named David who came from a middle-class background. For a time, Evelyn thought perhaps her daughter would be different, more rooted in gratitude, more willing to remember the sacrifices that had carried her so far. When Serena had her first child, Evelyn felt a burst of hope. She knitted blankets with her aching hands, saved what little money she had to buy small toys, and made the long trip to Charlotte to meet her grandchildren. The children were beautiful, and for a brief time, Evelyn felt the warmth of belonging again, rocking her granddaughter to sleep, playing peekaboo with her grandson, feeling that she was once more needed and cherished. But cracks appeared quickly. David made comments about Evelyn's appearance, suggesting quietly to Serena that her clothes were outdated and might embarrass the family in their new neighborhood. Evelyn pretended not to hear, though each word stung. She had dressed in her best clothes, the same ones she had carefully preserved for years, and she had thought she looked respectable. The breaking point arrived during Sunday dinner when Evelyn, eager to share a piece of her heart, prepared her traditional meal: cornbread, collard greens, and fried chicken, food that had carried her family through lean years with love. David wrinkled his nose after a single bite, remarking that the food was heavy, greasy, and unhealthy for the children. Serena, who had grown up on those very meals, said nothing in her mother's defense. Evelyn sat in silence, her heart bruised, before quietly clearing the plates. The final wound came the day she prepared to leave. Her 5-year-old grandson ran into the room and asked, "Grandma, are you coming to live with us? I like when you read me stories." Evelyn knelt and hugged him tightly, fighting back tears. But before she could answer, Serena appeared in the doorway, gently telling the boy to let Grandma go, that she had to catch her bus. The drive to the station was filled with awkward silence. Just before Evelyn stepped out of the car, Serena said, "Ma, I hope you understand. David and I are trying to build something here. We need to be mindful of appearances. Maybe next time we could go shopping for some new clothes, maybe change your hairstyle, just so you fit in better." Evelyn nodded with a forced smile and said softly, "Maybe so, baby, maybe so." She carried her small suitcase onto the bus, staring out the window at the life her daughter had built, realizing she was being written out of it piece by piece. The weight of rejection from both children pressed heavily on her chest. She had raised them on love, clothed them with dignity, fed them with sacrifice. Yet now she was seen as an embarrassment, a relic from a past they wanted to bury. She returned home, not just alone, but diminished in their eyes, and that knowledge hurt more than poverty ever had. She told herself that she had given everything she had to her children, that she had poured her youth and her health into building a bridge that they had chosen not to cross back to her, and though she tried to convince herself she was strong enough to bear it, her body began to betray her. The years of hard labor showed themselves in sharp ways. Her knees locked painfully each morning, her back screamed every time she bent down to scrub a floor, and her hands curled in permanent stiffness from decades of chemicals and endless cycles of mopping, scrubbing, and wringing out rags. Still, she forced herself to keep going, because stopping meant not only hunger, but also the collapse of the fragile independence she had managed to preserve. Yet one evening, as she returned from her night shift at the hospital, a job she had clung to despite the toll on her body, she felt an ache in her chest that spread down her left arm. At first, she ignored it, telling herself it was just fatigue, but when the pain left her breathless, she collapsed in the hallway of her building. Her neighbor, Mrs. Whitfield, the elderly widow who had become her closest companion, found her and called an ambulance. At the hospital, Evelyn was told she had suffered a mild heart attack, her blood pressure dangerously high, her heart strained from years of pushing herself beyond human limits. She spent 3 days under observation, surrounded not by children who owed their existence to her sacrifices, but by doctors, nurses, and social workers who asked for emergency contact information. With trembling hands, she hesitated, then wrote down the phone numbers of Malcolm and Serena. Calls were made, but Malcolm, now a senior marketing director, told his assistant to send flowers, and Serena, attending her son's soccer game, promised she would call later. Evelyn sat in her hospital bed, clutching the thin blanket, staring at the empty doorway, realizing that she was no longer a priority in her children's lives. When she was discharged, the doctors gave her a stack of prescriptions she could not afford and instructions to reduce stress and physical exertion, an impossible demand for someone whose only means of survival was cleaning offices for long hours. She returned to her apartment, stared at the water stains on the ceiling, and felt smaller than she ever had in her life. Mrs. Whitfield visited that evening, scolding her gently, telling her she was heartbroken and that carrying such pain alone was killing her faster than the work. Evelyn tried to dismiss it, claiming she was fine, but inside she knew she was unraveling. The following months grew harsher. Her energy was diminished, her appetite faded, and her body grew frail, but bills continued to arrive with merciless regularity. She scraped by, but when the landlord grew impatient about late rent, she realized she would soon be without a home. Out of desperation, she made a call she had avoided for years. She phoned Malcolm, her voice trembling as she told him about the heart attack, the missed work, and the looming eviction. He listened with a distracted tone, as if scrolling through emails while she spoke, then asked bluntly how much she needed. She whispered that $800 would cover the back rent and provide some relief. After a long pause, he sighed, telling her that it was a lot of money, that he and his wife Lisa were saving for a house renovation, but that he might manage a couple hundred. Days later, she received a check for $300 and a note suggesting she look into senior housing assistance programs. She held the envelope in her hands, tears slipping down her face, not just from disappointment, but from the crushing confirmation that she was now considered a burden rather than a mother worthy of care. The money helped briefly, but the problem remained. So Evelyn gathered her courage and called Serena next, hoping her daughter might respond with more compassion. Serena answered cheerfully, but quickly turned serious as her mother explained her situation. She spoke about how she and David were stretched thin with the mortgage, the children's activities, and college funds to save. She suggested her mother consider moving somewhere cheaper or applying for government aid. Evelyn told her she was already receiving food stamps and that senior housing had a 2-year waiting list. Serena's voice softened but remained detached. She told her mother that perhaps this was a blessing in disguise, that maybe it was time to downsize her expectations and live within her limits. Evelyn hung up the phone quietly, staring into the dim apartment, realizing that the two people she had built her life around saw her not as the mother who had sacrificed her health and youth, but as an inconvenience to be managed. She avoided eviction only by borrowing from Mrs. Whitfield, who offered the money reluctantly, knowing that she too lived on a fixed income, but she could not bear to see her friend thrown out on the street. Evelyn accepted, ashamed but grateful, and promised she would pay her back. As the summer came, the city was engulfed in a brutal heat wave, and Evelyn's small apartment became unbearable. Without air conditioning, she spent her days at the library or mall, sitting quietly in the cool air, clutching a small water bottle to her chest. One afternoon, after a long day of unbearable heat, Evelyn made a decision that would bring her the harshest humiliation yet. She decided to visit Malcolm unannounced, using her bus fare to ride out to his suburban home. She longed to see him, to meet Lisa properly, to witness the life she had helped make possible. She stood on the manicured lawn, her heart racing, and rang the doorbell. When Malcolm opened the door, his face shifted from surprise to annoyance to embarrassment. He stepped outside quickly, closing the door behind him, telling her she should not have come without calling. Evelyn apologized, explaining her phone had been disconnected, that she only wanted to see him, his house, and meet his wife. But Malcolm looked back toward the window where well-dressed guests mingled and said that it was not a good time, that Lisa had friends over, that these were professional people, and she would not understand. Evelyn asked softly if she could at least come in for a glass of water, but Malcolm's voice turned sharp as he glanced at her simple, worn dress and said she could not keep embarrassing him by showing up looking like some raggedy old woman begging for scraps. The words landed like blows, but Evelyn swallowed her pain and told him she only wanted to see her son. He softened briefly, gave her $40 for cab fare, and told her they would talk soon. She took the money, walked to the bus stop instead of hailing a cab, and sat in silence during the long ride home, his words echoing in her mind until she broke down in tears. Back at her building, Mrs. Whitfield found her in the hallway, her face wet, her spirit crushed. Evelyn told her what Malcolm had said, and Mrs. Whitfield shook her head, furious at his cruelty, telling her she had given everything, that success had corrupted her children. She had told Mrs. Whitfield that she would stop reaching out, that if her children wanted her in their lives, they would have to come on their own. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, she realized the silence was confirmation that neither Malcolm nor Serena would come. She poured herself into survival, walking to her cleaning job at dawn, clutching her chest when the pain returned, and returning home to her tiny apartment where she ate little more than bread and canned soup. The loneliness gnawed at her as much as hunger did, and the isolation made her body feel even weaker. Mrs. Whitfield visited often, sometimes bringing her a hot meal, sometimes sitting with her for hours just to make sure she was not completely alone, and Evelyn appreciated it deeply. But she also knew that the love of a neighbor could never truly replace the love of a son or a daughter. By late 2016, her body could no longer keep up with her willpower. Another hard episode struck her at work, this time collapsing in a supply closet where a security guard found her unconscious. He called an ambulance against her protests, and she woke up in a hospital to the familiar sterile white walls, another list of prescriptions, and another warning from doctors that she needed to stop working. Once again, the social workers attempted to contact her children. Malcolm was busy with business meetings and sent only a brief message asking if she was stable, while Serena called a day later with a tone that sounded more like obligation than concern. Evelyn closed her eyes as her daughter's voice drifted through the receiver, speaking about braces for Emma and college fund for Jordan before quickly ending the call. Evelyn realized in that moment that her children's lives had moved so far beyond her that she existed only on the edges, a shadow of responsibility they tried to ignore. When she returned home from the hospital, the reality of her situation hit harder than ever before. She could not keep up with her rent. Her reduced hours left her with barely enough to buy food, and the looming threat of eviction became unbearable. She managed to stave it off temporarily by borrowing more from Mrs. Whitfield, but the guilt of knowing her elderly neighbor had dipped into her own limited savings haunted her. She promised herself she would repay the debt, though she secretly feared she would never be able to. By the start of 2017, the eviction notice finally arrived. Evelyn had 30 days to vacate the apartment, and though she had fought off eviction before, this time there were no more favors left to call in, no more loans to borrow, and no more excuses to offer. The humiliation of losing her home at her age, after everything she had endured, broke something inside her. Mrs. Whitfield helped her search for alternatives, and eventually Evelyn found a room in a boarding house across town. It was all she could afford, a small dimly lit room with a single bed, a cracked mirror, and a shared bathroom down the hall. The house was filled with people battling their own demons, addiction, mental illness, poverty, and though she tried to keep to herself, she could not help but feel that she had been abandoned to the margins of society, discarded just like the others. Moving day was one of the hardest of her life. She and Mrs. Whitfield carried her meager belongings, clothes, a few kitchen items, a shoebox filled with Serena's old letters, into the borrowed pickup truck both women weeping quietly. For Evelyn, the act of leaving behind the apartment that had once been filled with her children's laughter felt like burying a piece of herself. The boarding house quickly revealed itself to be as harsh as she feared. Thin walls meant no privacy. The smell of cigarettes and cheap liquor filled the hallways, and the clatter of arguments often erupted late into the night. She kept her door locked, spending most of her time sitting quietly on the bed, staring at the shoebox of letters and the few photographs she had of Malcolm and Serena. She still went to work, though the commute was long and exhausting, involving multiple bus transfers that drained both her body and her spirit. Hunger grew worse, her body shrank, and her reflection in the cracked mirror became a haunting reminder of Malcolm's cruel words. Her hair thinned, her cheeks hollowed, and her shoulders slumped from exhaustion, until even she began to see the ragged figure he had described. One evening, as she returned from the corner store carrying a small loaf of bread and a carton of milk, a group of teenagers loitering near the boarding house jeered at her. One of them, no older than 16, looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust and said, "Damn, Grandma, you look rough. Where's your kids? How'd they let you end up looking like that?" Evelyn could not answer. She kept walking, her throat burning with tears she refused to shed in front of strangers. She carried the words inside, letting them echo in the silence of her room until she finally broke down, sobbing into her thin pillow. That night, she prayed differently. Instead of asking God to protect Malcolm and Serena, she asked for strength for herself. Instead of pleading for their happiness, she begged for her own peace. Instead of asking for their love, she asked to be surrounded by people who would value her, who would see her worth. It was the first time in decades she allowed herself to pray for herself and not just for them, and it marked the beginning of a quiet transformation. She realized she had spent her entire life giving, sacrificing, and enduring, but she could no longer afford to keep waiting for the love of children who had chosen to abandon her. She saw herself reflected in the cracked mirror each morning, thinner than ever, her hair gray and sparse, her hands knotted from arthritis. Each time she caught her own reflection, she remembered Malcolm's words, and though she tried to push them away, they whispered back that he'd seen her as nothing but a burden. She still clung to the hope of dignity, but dignity felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. The other tenants at the boarding house kept to themselves, many lost in their own struggles, and while Evelyn was polite, she did not build friendships there. She missed the warmth of Mrs. Whitfield, who still called and sometimes came to visit, though the distance made it hard. It was in this lonely state that life, in its unpredictable way, turned in a direction Evelyn could never have imagined. One afternoon in the fall of 2018, a man in a suit appeared at the door of the boarding house, asking for her by name. At first, she feared it was some government official coming to scold her for being behind on bills, or perhaps to deliver another eviction notice. But when he introduced himself as Attorney Johnson, she grew even more puzzled. He explained that he had been searching for her for months and had finally hired an investigator to locate her. She invited him into the small, dim room, embarrassed by its condition, and listened as he carefully unfolded the news. Her brother Jerome, whom she had not seen in over 15 years, had passed away in Detroit earlier that year. Evelyn felt a sharp pang of guilt for having lost touch, remembering childhood days when she and Jerome had shared meals, laughed together, and endured the struggles of their parents' hard labor. Life had separated them, and though she had thought of him over the years, she never imagined he had been watching her life from afar. Attorney Johnson handed her an envelope with her name written on it in Jerome's familiar handwriting and told her that Jerome had left his entire estate to her. Evelyn blinked in disbelief, clutching the envelope as if it might vanish. Johnson explained that Jerome had been a successful businessman, investing wisely in real estate and other ventures, and that his estate was valued at approximately $60 million. Evelyn's thin frame trembled as she tried to process the words. She had spent her entire life stretching a dollar until it tore, choosing between rent and food, medicine and warmth. And now she was being told she possessed a fortune she could barely comprehend. She opened the envelope with trembling hands and read Jerome's words, his love pouring through the page. He reminded her of how she had cared for him when they were young, of how she had shared what little she had with him when he had nothing. He confessed regret at not reconnecting sooner, but explained that he had always trusted she was being cared for by her children. He left her not only the money, but also a clause. If her children had abandoned her or failed to provide for her, they would inherit nothing, leaving Evelyn full discretion over how to distribute the estate. Tears blurred her vision as she read. Her brother had remembered her, honored her, and valued her in a way her own children had not. That night, Evelyn lay awake on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She imagined the possibilities, paying off debts, moving into a warm, safe home, eating food without rationing each bite, getting proper medical care, and finally living without fear of eviction. But even as joy surged inside her, a deeper sorrow followed. Jerome, her distant brother, had done what her own children could not. He had seen her worth. Malcolm and Serena, who owed everything to her sacrifices, had turned away while Jerome had reached back. The irony cut deep. She did not immediately share the news with anyone except Mrs. Whitfield, who cried tears of relief when she heard it. Evelyn told her that she did not want mansions or luxuries, that what she longed for was peace and a sense of belonging. Mrs. Whitfield told her gently that money could not buy love, but it could buy security and the ability to create the family she deserved. Evelyn nodded, beginning to realize that perhaps she could turn this blessing into something greater than herself. Over the following weeks, Attorney Johnson guided her through the legal process. She moved out of the boarding house into a modest hotel while searching for a home, bought new clothes that fit her properly, and visited doctors who prescribed the medication she had needed for years. The transformation was astonishing. Within months, she looked healthier, stronger, and more alive than she had in decades. Yet she knew the emotional scars of abandonment would not heal so easily. She resolved not to tell Malcolm or Serena about the inheritance, at least not yet. She wanted to see if they would reach out to her on their own, if any trace of genuine concern for her remained. Meanwhile, she began looking at properties, not the glamorous mansions that realtors tried to push on her, but homes with heart and history. One day, she found an old mansion in an older neighborhood, once used as a group home for children, but now falling into disrepair. Where others saw peeling paint and broken windows, Evelyn saw potential. She walked through its halls and imagined the laughter of children filling the rooms again. She told Attorney Johnson this was the place, and though he reminded her that she could afford something far nicer, she insisted. She would renovate it, not for prestige, but for purpose. With her fortune, she could have lived in comfort for the rest of her days. But Evelyn Carter's heart had always belonged to children, to sacrifice, to giving. She envisioned creating a safe haven for homeless and forgotten children, a place where they would know love, guidance, and stability, the very things her own children had once received but had forgotten. She decided she would fill the mansion not with wealth or status symbols, but with second chances. That decision marked the beginning of her redemption, not only for herself, but for others who had been cast aside. She saw the faint shadows of children running through the halls, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. She saw long dining tables where children could sit together as family. She saw bedrooms filled not with loneliness, but with belonging. Her brother's money could have bought her a penthouse, a beach house, or a modern estate. But Evelyn had never desired wealth for herself. What she desired most was to restore dignity, to create family where there was none, and to ensure that children who had been discarded would find the love her own children had forgotten. Renovations began almost immediately, and Evelyn worked side by side with contractors, cleaning crews, and volunteers. Though she had the money to pay others to do everything, she insisted on being part of the process. She painted walls with her own hands, sanded wood, and scrubbed away years of neglect. Every brush stroke felt like a prayer, every nail hammered like a promise. Her body, though frail, seemed renewed by the purpose. She had spent decades cleaning the homes of others, scrubbing away dirt while remaining invisible. But now she was cleaning her own home, not for status, but for love. The mansion began to transform. Bedrooms were filled with beds and linens, kitchens stocked with food, and classrooms outfitted with books and supplies. Evelyn reached out to local social services and foster organizations, explaining her vision: a home for children who had nowhere else to go, a place where love and discipline would walk hand in hand, a place where no child would ever feel abandoned. Soon, the first children arrived. Some were teenagers aging out of the foster system. Others were younger children whose families could not care for them. Each carried a story of hardship, trauma, or neglect, and each arrived with eyes that reflected the same loneliness Evelyn had carried in her own soul. She welcomed them one by one, hugging them as though they were her own. "You're safe now," she told them. "This is your home." They began to call her Mama Evelyn, and though at first the name startled her, soon it filled her with warmth. She had longed for family, and though Malcolm and Serena had failed her, these children embraced her with a purity of gratitude that mended the cracks in her heart. Evelyn established rules in the house, not out of harshness, but out of love. Everyone had chores, everyone respected one another, and everyone contributed. She cooked meals, and soon the kitchen became the center of the home, filled with the smell of cornbread, stews, and fresh vegetables. Around the table, she taught them lessons her own children had once heard. That family was about showing up, that dignity came from effort, and that no one was poor if they had love. The children listened, and many of them, for the first time in their lives, believed her. She used her inheritance wisely, ensuring the home had sustainable funding. She hired counselors, teachers, and mentors to help guide the children, but she remained the heart of the place. She was present in their daily lives, helping with homework, attending school meetings, cheering at sports games, and sitting beside them when nightmares shook their sleep. Slowly, the mansion filled not just with furniture, but with hope. The community began to take notice. Newspapers published stories about the remarkable woman who had once been forgotten herself, but had used her fortune to lift others. Reporters came to interview her, but Evelyn always deflected attention, saying the real heroes were the children who were finding strength after hardship. She insisted that love was the foundation of everything, and she repeated it so often that the children began to believe it, too. Meanwhile, Malcolm and Serena remained unaware. They lived their lives in comfortable ignorance, assuming their mother was still struggling, still invisible, still poor. They never asked, and Evelyn no longer offered. She was no longer begging for scraps of their attention. Instead, she was surrounded by dozens of children who valued her presence, who ran to hug her when she entered a room, who called her Mama with genuine affection. Among them was a teenager named Destiny, who reminded Evelyn of herself at that age. Fiercely determined, yet carrying the scars of abandonment. Destiny became Evelyn's shadow, helping in the kitchen, reading beside her, and confessing fears about the future. One evening, Destiny said, "Mama Evelyn, my guidance counselor thinks I can get a scholarship, but I don't want to leave the little ones here." Who's going to look after them like you looked after me?" Evelyn cupped her face and said, "Baby girl, you're going to college. That's not up for discussion. You'll show them what's possible. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is the love we built here." Destiny wept in her arms, whispering that she loved her, and Evelyn felt the fullness of a mother's joy. The mansion became a place of second chances. Children who had once been angry, withdrawn, or hopeless began to smile, to laugh, to dream. Some discovered talents in art, music, or sports. Others found strength in academics. Evelyn guided each one, teaching them that their past did not define them, that their future was theirs to build. Each success story filled her with a pride she had once reserved for Malcolm and Serena. And though a part of her still ached for the love of her biological children, she realized she had found something equally powerful: chosen family. In time, the home became more than just a refuge. It became a community. Volunteers came to tutor, neighbors brought food, and local churches partnered to provide support. Evelyn stood at the center of it all, not seeking recognition, but simply living her truth. That love, when given freely, multiplies. She thought often of Jerome, her brother who had given her the means to create this legacy, and she prayed nightly, thanking him for remembering her when others had not. She imagined him smiling, proud that his sister had turned money into something no amount of wealth alone could buy. Her own children still posted pictures on social media of vacations, promotions, and suburban lives, never mentioning her. She had learned to live without their calls, their visits, or their affection, but she never stopped being their mother. And deep down, she wanted them to see who she had become, not the ragged figure Malcolm had dismissed at his door, but the strong and purposeful woman who had built something beautiful from the ashes of abandonment. It was this desire to teach them a lesson, not out of vengeance, but out of hope for their redemption, that led her to craft an elaborate plan. She met with Attorney Johnson, the man who had handled her brother's estate, and confided in him that she wanted to stage her own death. He was hesitant at first, warning her of the risks and the cruelty of such a deception, but Evelyn explained that her children had already buried her in their hearts. She wanted them to feel the weight of finality, to understand regret, and then to be confronted with the truth of her life's transformation. She believed only such a dramatic act could pierce the walls of pride they had built around themselves. Mrs. Whitfield agreed to help, as did the staff at the children's home who loved her like family. The plan took months to prepare. Evelyn stopped returning phone calls from distant relatives, and with Johnson's help, word spread quietly that she had passed peacefully in her sleep. Arrangements were made for a funeral service at a large church in her old neighborhood, the same neighborhood where she had once carried her children to school and walked miles to cleaning jobs. News of her death spread quickly, and the church filled with people who remembered her kindness, her resilience, and her sacrifices. Neighbors came, former co-workers arrived, and parents of children she had helped in the past attended. They filled the pews with genuine grief, but two people sat in the front row feigning sorrow: Malcolm and Serena. They wore expensive black clothing, their jewelry gleaming under the lights, and though they carried the posture of dutiful children, Evelyn knew, watching unseen from a private viewing room in the church, that their grief was shallow, their minds already wondering about what material benefits might follow. The pastor spoke warmly of Evelyn's sacrifices, recalling the stories of how she had raised 2 children alone, worked multiple jobs, and endured humiliation without ever letting go of her faith. Mrs. Whitfield gave a eulogy that brought tears to the congregation, speaking of Evelyn's kindness, her strength, and the way she had built a second family from the children who now called her mama. Many others shared memories, some of which even Evelyn had forgotten. The time she had given her last dollar to a neighbor in need, the countless nights she stayed up mending clothes for children who were not her own, the gospel songs she sang that lifted spirits even in the darkest hours. All the while, Malcolm and Serena shifted in their seats, checking phones, whispering about their own schedules. When the funeral ended, the attendees gathered for the reading of Evelyn's will. Attorney Johnson stood before them with documents. His voice steady as he read aloud the words Evelyn herself had carefully written. To my son, Malcolm Carter, who once told me I was some raggedy old woman begging for scraps, I leave my forgiveness and the hope that you will learn to value family before it is too late. Murmurs filled the room as eyes turned toward Malcolm, his face flushed with embarrassment. Johnson continued, to my daughter, Serena Williams, who once suggested I needed to change myself to fit into her world, I leave my love and the prayer that she will teach her children to honor their elders rather than be ashamed of them. Serena squirmed in her seat, tears brimming in her eyes, though Evelyn knew they were more for the spectacle than from genuine remorse. Then Johnson paused, letting the silence hang before delivering the revelation. The remainder of my estate, valued at approximately $60 million, inherited from my brother Jerome, I leave not to my children, but to the Carter Home for Children, the sanctuary I founded for the forgotten and abandoned. These children, who showed me love when my own did not, shall inherit the legacy I built. The room erupted in gasps, and Evelyn, hidden from view, watched as Malcolm leapt to his feet, his voice rising in anger. That's impossible. Our mother was poor. She had nothing. Johnson remained calm. Your mother lived modestly, yes, but she chose to invest her inheritance into something greater than herself. She became a mother not only to you, but to dozens of children who will carry forward her legacy. Serena wept openly, clutching her husband's hand, but even from afar, Evelyn could see that her grief was for lost wealth, not for a lost mother. Johnson continued reading. Furthermore, I establish a trust for my grandchildren to be overseen by Mrs. Whitfield until they reach adulthood. This money comes with the condition that they learn about their grandmother's sacrifices and honor her memory, for wealth without wisdom is nothing but emptiness. By the end of the reading, the reality had sunk in. Malcolm and Serena had lost not only the inheritance, but the moral claim to their mother's legacy. They left the church in a haze of shock, their reputations tarnished in the eyes of the community that had once admired Evelyn's sacrifices. But the lesson had been delivered. Evelyn remained hidden, tears streaming down her face, not from joy at their humiliation, but from sorrow that it had taken such a drastic act for them to face the truth. Over the next days, Malcolm and Serena tried desperately to contact Johnson, demanding explanations, threatening legal action, but they could not undo the fact that they had abandoned the very woman who had given them everything. For Evelyn, the funeral marked a turning point. She had forced her children to confront the reality of who she was and what she had built, and though the pain was immense, she believed it was necessary. At first, anger and denial consumed them. Anger at being excluded, denial that their mother had outgrown their narrow perception of her. But as the days turned into weeks and silence from Attorney Johnson confirmed the will was airtight, their defenses began to crack. Evelyn, watching from a careful distance, knew that time would either harden their hearts or soften them toward truth, and she prepared herself for either outcome. When she finally sent them letters revealing that she was still alive, she did not write with malice, but with clarity. She told them that she had staged her death because they had already buried her in their hearts, and she wanted them to understand the weight of finality, the ache of regret. She invited them to the children's home, not to grovel, but to witness what she had built, and she warned them that if they came, it must be with humility, not entitlement. Malcolm was the first to arrive, his pride battered but his heart quietly yearning. He drove to the mansion on a Saturday afternoon, still unsure of what he would say. When he stepped through the gate, he heard children laughing in the yard, saw them running across the grass, chasing one another with the easy joy of those who knew they belonged somewhere. He knocked on the door, and when Evelyn opened it, he froze. She looked healthier than he remembered, her hair neat, her eyes bright, her shoulders squared with quiet strength. "Hello, Malcolm," she said simply. Tears filled his eyes. "Ma, you thought I was gone," she finished. "But I'm still here, and I have a family that needed me." She gestured to the children peeking curiously from the hallway. They ran to her, wrapping their arms around her legs, calling her Mama Evelyn, and Malcolm felt the sting of shame burn inside him. For hours, he followed her through the house, meeting the children, hearing their stories, listening to how his mother had become a lifeline to them. When he finally sat across from her in the office she had converted into a meeting room, he whispered, "I don't deserve to be here." Evelyn looked at him gently and said, "You're still my son." Redemption isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to do right from now on. Malcolm wept openly, promising to try, and she told him to begin not with promises but with consistent action. In the weeks that followed, he returned often, slowly earning the children's trust, contributing his skills in fundraising and business management, and showing that he was learning to value family in a way he never had before. Serena's path was more difficult. She avoided the letter for weeks, too ashamed to face her mother, but curiosity and the whisper of longing in her children's questions finally drew her to the mansion. She arrived with hesitation, clutching the hands of Jordan and Emma, who had been told they would meet their grandmother's other family. When Evelyn opened the door and saw her daughter standing there with her grandchildren, she felt a rush of conflicting emotions: love, grief, anger, and hope, but she chose grace. "Welcome," she said softly, kneeling to embrace the children. Serena watched as her children immediately bonded with the others, running off to play without hesitation. Inside, she admitted, "I'm jealous, Ma. These kids love you like I always wish my kids would. I wanted you to be their grandmother, but I pushed you away." Evelyn reached for her hand and said, "Then bring them here. Let them know their grandmother not by what you told them, but by what they see for themselves." Slowly, Serena, too, became part of the home, using her social work experience to strengthen counseling programs and learning to rebuild trust with her mother. Her children flourished in the environment, growing close to the others and gaining a deeper understanding of gratitude and resilience. Over time, the Carter Home for Children became not just Evelyn's legacy, but a shared mission. Malcolm used his business connections to establish partnerships with local colleges, providing scholarships and internships for the children. Serena developed new therapeutic services to help them process trauma and build confidence. The mansion, once abandoned, now pulsed with life, laughter, and hope, serving as a model for other communities. Evelyn, now in her 70s, watched this transformation with quiet pride. She had once believed her story was defined by rejection, but now she knew it was defined by redemption. She had built a family from broken pieces, and in the process, she had given her own children a chance to rediscover what mattered. One evening, as the sun set over the home and children played in the yard, Evelyn sat on the porch with Mrs. Whitfield, who had moved into a small apartment on the property so she could continue to be part of the family she had helped nurture. "You know what I love most about this place?" Mrs. Whitfield said, watching Jordan teach a younger boy how to throw a baseball while Emma braided another girl's hair. "It's full of second chances. You got a second chance at family. Those children got a second chance at childhood. Even Malcolm and Serena got a second chance at being the children they should have been." Evelyn nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "We all did. And that's what life is about, isn't it? Not perfection, but second chances." As night fell, Evelyn tucked the youngest children into bed, singing softly as their eyelids drooped. Downstairs, Malcolm and Serena finished paperwork for new programs while their children laughed with others in the common room. Evelyn paused, listening to the harmony of voices and footsteps, and realized she was surrounded by more wealth than any inheritance could buy. Her legacy was not the $60 million, but the lives transformed, the love multiplied, and the lesson taught. That family is not defined by blood, but by presence, sacrifice, and love. When she finally laid down to rest, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for Jerome, for Mrs. Whitfield, for the children, even for Malcolm and Serena. She had lived long enough to see her pain turn into purpose, her rejection into redemption. Her story was proof that the truest inheritance is not money but love, and that the deepest wealth is found in the hearts you touch and the lives you change. The end. If you followed Evelyn Carter's journey through poverty, abandonment, heartbreak, and finally redemption, you know this story carries more than just pain. It carries a message about second chances, dignity, and the true meaning of family. Before you go, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. If you found this story powerful, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story like this. It helps us bring more narratives that matter, stories that remind us of the lessons we sometimes forget. I also want to hear from you. What part of Evelyn's story struck you the hardest? Was it her children turning away from her? Or was it the way she built a new family from love and resilience? And if you were in her position, would you have forgiven Malcolm and Serena? Or would you have cut them off completely? Tell me your thoughts down in the comments. Share where in the world you are watching from, because each perspective adds something valuable to the conversation. We read every comment, and your words matter. Thank you for spending your time with this story. Stay tuned for the next one. It might just be the reminder you need about what truly lasts when everything else fades.